So, welcome to Global Legal Tech Talks, presented in partnership with Net Documents. My name is Frances Anderson. I'm CEO of Net Law Media, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's live session. Beyond AI pilots, building a legal foundation that scales. Across the legal sector, AI experimentation is well underway, but as firms move beyond pilots and point solutions, a new challenge has emerged. Fragmented systems, disconnected content, and weak information governance are now the real barriers to turning AI ambition into sustainable business value. This is going to be a practical, forward looking conversation, and we're joined by three distinguished panelists who bring first hand experience of building digital information foundations that support long term success. So, to guiding today's session is our chair, Tony McKenna. This webinar is live and we actively encourage your participation. So please use the Q&A or the chat function at the bottom of your screen to submit questions for our panel, and we'll do our best to address them during the session. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce our chair. Tony McKenna is the Chief Information Officer at Lawfront, a leading group of regional law firms with extensive experience in the legal sector digital transformation. Tony specializes in aligning technology, strategy with business objectives to deliver measurable innovation and operational excellence. Tony has actually also has also chaired European and international technology planning councils, led by the annual European ILTACON on multiple occasions. Now, please join me in welcoming Tony McKenna. Tony, it's over to you.
Thank you, Francis. That was a bit of a mouthful. Apologies for that. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Conscious that these types of sessions can reach far and wide. So welcome to the session. As Francis says, I'm Tony McKenna. I'm CIO at Lawfront, and I'm thoroughly looking forward to chatting to you today in conjunction with Nigel and Colleen. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Nigel. I'm going to ask him to, Nigel is Chief Digital Officer at Oric, and I'm going to ask him to introduce himself and then pass on to Colleen.
Thanks very much, Tony. I'm delighted to be on today's webinar and following on Tony's point, welcoming everybody to hopefully what will be a lively, interesting and informed discussion. As Tony said, I'm Nigel Tranter. I am the Chief Digital Officer at Oric. My remit covers AI, data, business transformation, digital fluency, and really how the organization operates as a business. I come from a foundation of 7 years in legal, and predominantly the rest of my career in financial services across global banks and financial institutions. It's a pleasure to be with everyone, and I'm looking forward to the conversation and chat ahead. And with that, I'll hand over to Colleen.
Hello, everyone. I'm happy to be here today, and just wanted to apologize first off. I'm overcoming a little bit of a cold, so I'm slightly congested. I am a legal solutions director at Net Documents. So my role is really what I describe as bridging the legal mind with the technical one. So helping law firms and legal teams really understand where AI best fits into the legal workflow. I also work quite closely with our product team in designing the AI tools that genuinely fit how lawyers work. And prior to Net Documents, I worked at Freshfields as a senior associate in their capital markets team. So I've got very real experience and insight into what lawyers really need from their information environment, and then how AI can enhance that.
Thank you, Colleen. Really interesting to hear from both of you. Just really first off, before we dive into the meat of things here, why is this important to you? And I'll just ask you, Colleen, why is this idea of going beyond the pilot, and having those secure foundations? Why is that important to you, and why should the colleagues on the webinar listen to us?
So my first interaction with AI was at Freshfields when they started rolling out their AI toolkit in 2025. And they really encouraged the lawyers to work with the innovation team to test the tools and provide feedback. And I found that process very engaging because I could really see that this wasn't just a new piece of technology. This was a change in how lawyers actually work, how they find information, how they draft documents, how they review them. And I chose NetDocuments specifically because of one conviction, is that the center of any firm's AI journey really comes down to the document management system, because that is sort of the central piece of all knowledge. Every document, every precedent, every negotiated position the firm has ever produced lives there. So for any firm to create an environment where AI works reliably and trusted, then you really need to start with that piece, because that, I think, is really the key foundation.
It's really great to hear that from somebody who's sat in that world and sees the importance of documents. We often get swept away in the technology world and forget that actually there's this kind of core product that we deliver, which is the intellectual understanding of our lawyers and interpretation of the challenges that our clients, and it all goes down onto a document and gets delivered out in that way. And Nigel, your thoughts on this topic and why it's important to you?
I'm going to start with an honest question, I think, to get us thinking about this. I think the honest question is, not which AI I should use, because if you think of it in one aspect, AI is just a tool like many tools that we have in an organization, but it's really around the content governance and the layer that sits beneath it, and how much of that can I trust? I mean, I'm just paraphrasing the question. I think if you worked in tech any length of time, scrub out AI and replace it with system, the same point still applies. We ultimately rely on the data that's presented through a system or through AI to be trusted, governed, and well understood. And that is no different whether we're using AI or any system. I think for this session also, another question is how do we stop thinking of AI as innovation projects, and rather how do they connect into an information architecture so that you can start to scale, rather than just thinking that, to Colleen's point, AI has been around now a couple of years in a guise we probably most of us touch and feel. I think we're beyond thinking about it being a project now, an innovation project. It's kind of got to become sustainable.
Yeah, particularly as we've seen lots of stuff in the press about where it feels that it's going to hit not just our profession, but every profession, every part of walk of life, So the challenge of being slow adopters is something that's laid at our door often in terms of technology and process change. And it really feels like this is one of those things you can't be a slow adopter on. You really need to get on just get on and get it delivered and implemented. So with that said, let's break the thing down. Let's have a look at this from how do you turn these pilots and these good, innovative sort of periods where people have been almost playing with the technology to see how it actually works, and how can I start to develop a use case? Actually, let's break the problem down and say, right, okay, why do we need core foundation, and what is AI readiness really in a law firm? And I'll chuck that over to you, Nigel, to start with.
Why is a small question, but there's a big impact to the why. From experience, the foundational problem that I alluded to earlier is a real problem. My observation is firms have spent perhaps 2 years, maybe a little bit longer, acquiring AI capability, experimenting with it, piloting, those kind of things. That kind of brings us up to date. But they've probably spent the best part of 2 decades or more accumulating content chaos without any structure around it, because it's kind of data and it's just there and we create it and we use it. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to put the capability across chaos without having a model in which we can do that. So for me, the foundational problem is really real. And I see this 3 patterns that I see emerging out of this. And Colleen, I'm not calling out DMS here, but I'm going to use it as an example. I'm sure you'll correct me a bit later. DMS environments without the right structure can have no enforced metadata. So straight away we've got no structure in which to understand the data. The second pattern I see is permissions inheritance. So AI doesn't observe without any kind of structure around it, permissions inheritance. So it can cause chaos on top of already a chaotic layer. So that's another foundational. And then the third pattern I see is no authoritative source for AI. AI, if it doesn't have guidance around what is an authoritative source, it can't really reason over it, and it can't resolve the ambiguity that's inherently within content that is not structured, not right metadata around it, and not the right governance. And all that happens then is it just amplifies the problem. People, when we first started using AI, were very cognizant around hallucinations, and there was a lot of hype around hallucinations. But without the ambiguity being resolved, you've just got another form of hallucination. How do you trust what the AI is responding back if you don't understand the foundation? You certainly haven't resolved the foundation. I often see weak taxonomies. If taxonomies are applied at all, again, causes a problem. And you simply then end up with data being filed in wrong places, with the wrong context, with the wrong structure around it, and that just then becomes bigger and bigger and more wrong answers at scale rather than problem resolution. So that's the kind of thing, Tony, that I would say there's a lot more we could go into how foundational problems are wrong, but that kind of gives you a kind of insight as to some of the patterns I've seen emerging when dealing with foundational data.
It's really interesting, that whole concept of actually we'll just run generative AI across our data pool, and we'll just get this golden nugget straight out of it, and we'll just be able to apply it. And we know very well, and certainly in the roles that I've had over the last 20 years, that we do have a propensity to store everything and categorize nothing. And it's really been stored for that kind of risk mitigation if the client comes back and there's an issue. There's some kind of claim against the firm. So it's this idea we keep everything just as a kind of defense mechanism, where actually that's where we should be looking at it from the other end of the telescope, which is actually this is rich data, and we should be able to sweat it. But obviously the challenge is then around saying, categorization and what can you share, what should you have, what should it be able to access, all those kind of good challenges. So Colleen, just from your perspective, why is the document management system, and you can maybe just broaden that a little bit, why is it not just a filing cabinet? I've often sort of suggested that in previous conversations that it's just where you put the document, and it just disappears into this dusty virtual world, So why is it more strategic than we maybe currently recognise or have recognised in the past?
I think that people think of the classic DMS as a filing cabinet, and I think that mindset has created a lot of the problems that Nigel was talking about. You file your documents away, sometimes correctly, sometimes not. They're secure and safe in the DMS, and that's enough. And then to navigate the DMS, you either had to pretty much know where things were filed or rely on a keyword search to surface them, which wasn't always necessarily easiest. And as a result of that, the information stored in there would be accessible to some, but invisible to most people. And then as people left the firm, that knowledge walked out the door with them. But I think AI has given us two key tools to really unlock the DMS and help us navigate it in a much more helpful way. So I think the first really big one is AI profiling. So Nigel mentioned metadata, and AI profiling essentially uses AI to automatically extract the metadata from your documents and then enriches them with it. So this is things like document type, jurisdiction. You can even do particular clause types if you want to do like change of control or termination. And then you can use this metadata to filter your documents. So I like to think about it like a library. So if you walk into a library without a catalog or an indexing system, which is what your classic DMS would be, and you're trying to find something, you can read every single document in there and eventually you'll find it, but it's going to take a lot of time. So metadata is basically the catalog. It's what turns the millions of documents in a firm's DMS into a usable system of knowledge. And what you need AI for is you can't rely on lawyers to populate this metadata. And I know, having been one, I never ever thought about metadata at all before I joined NetDocuments. No, it was just simply not a priority for me. And AI profiling removes the dependency on the lawyer saving the document because it has AI extracted automatically. And then layered on top of all this rich metadata, you have the AI search functions. And this allows lawyers to filter the DMS in a natural language format, which just makes it much more easier to find things. And so I think these two tools together really transform the DMS from that old filing cabinet model and make it into more of an intelligent partner.
It's a really interesting observation. You say that you never really thought about metadata. To be honest, I didn't really think about metadata until I joined a law firm. And when you're, subjected to, you have to use this thing called the DMS, and and you're sort of thinking, well, actually, when I create a document, I'm asked a whole bunch of questions, right? I always choose blank, right? And you think to yourself, somebody had really thought about this sort of stuff before, right? They had really kind of thought about it, and designed in the capability to start that categorization at the moment that you create a piece of content, and yet gave everybody that get out clause with a blank document or whatever it was, and so when you look and when I've looked at information lifecycle management over the years within the various firms, and always looked at content and thought, wow, really, we have so much content. I have no idea whether it's cakes on the third floor or whether it's really a really great piece of text that could be used or a clause that could be used across the firm. So yeah, it's an interesting perspective to hear from you, Colleen, about how so okay, so there's a problem, right? We know there's a problem, right? And it's always good to be in a group and talk about the problem and then feel in some kind of therapy session and feel refreshed from the back of it. But let's see if there's some things that we can do. So Nigel, coming to you. So data management at scale. So why clean? Why govern? Why is that really important? And is it still important? Because surely we can just ask it a question in natural language and it'll just know the answer.
You could ask a question, but how do you know that question's right and accurate? So why does it matter? Well, imagine a scenario where you've got a partner going into a really important client meeting, and the partner's using a piece of AI to retrieve some information, tear sheet before they go in, a briefing paper, and it pulls the wrong client piece, vital piece of information in front of the client. And that partner then has a conversation that is completely the wrong construct or wrong context. I think that would be reputationally damaging. Now, to give, and we know this is directionally where we're headed. We know that the AI is going to be threaded in assisting us in lots of ways we do work. Why would you not be having a conversation either now or in the near future with a piece of AI to brief you before you go into a really important client meeting? I would certainly want to ensure that the AI has got the most accurate, up-to-date and trusted source of a response if I was going into that client meeting. So for me, that matters. But that conversation matters anytime we're having a data conversation in an organization where knowledge is something that we trade our reputation on, particularly in law firms. So therefore, understanding that the source is right, understanding that the policies around it ensure that the risk is managed, understanding that we use the term metadata, that being able to find the right source at the right time for the right context is super important, and that our governance is solid. So what do I mean by governance? You were asking about these foundational things. Well, back to my point around the client context, how do you know the quality of the data is right? How do you know that the integrity? So the version that you're referring to is the current version, and it's not 2 versions old and there's been a change and that's not being registered. Those are the things that also have always mattered, but they matter even more when you've got a system like AI that hasn't got the human context yet to look at a piece of data and say, do you know what? That doesn't look right. There's something not right about that data. We do that inherently when we're looking at a piece of data. In that client example, if there was a piece of data within the client context, you would immediately be able to pull that and think that's not right. We're not talking about the same client here. The AI does not have that sophistication to do that right now. So those foundations, those things, the governance, and I think there's another important piece as well, Tony, I would insert here. And we can talk about this a little bit later around the practical needs of interlacing the AI into trusted data is master data management. How do I know where to find the right source of that data? We know that we've got in any law firm many systems that hold, let's say my example, Nigel Tranter. I might exist in one system as Nigel Tranter, Tranter Nigel, Mr. N Tranter, Mr. NL Tranter. Which is the right source for referencing Nigel Tranter in that context? So therefore, master data makes it, and particularly as AI comes in, and if I want to use AI to reference me in a particular question, which version of those 5 versions of me does the AI know is right? So again, we start to build these things around it.
It's really interesting because master data is something that, believe it or not, in the late 90s, actually mid to late 90s, we did a whole exercise when I was in a utility business around master data and single source of truth and starting the life cycle of a object through the course of the systems. And the technology wasn't really there at the time to make that a viable outcome. Some really clever people come up with the design, but you look at it today and you think, actually, it's really there. It's the capability is definitely there in the technology. It's about the wherewithal and the desire within organizations to really grasp this and move it along. When I was at Howard Kennedy, we started a whole exercise on taxonomy. And I remember thinking to myself at the time, why do we really need to be doing this taxonomy thing? Because actually, surely AI is just going to come up and I'll just be able to ask that question. But the more I got into the more closely I got to the knowledge team and understanding that why taxonomy was really important, actually it opened your eyes to see actually taxonomy is a way of actually accelerating the access to the right data. So I had to really eat humble pie and step back from my initial thoughts. Fortunately, I wasn't very verbose about my thoughts. I just went with it. But Colleen, coming to you, these sort of things to try and create that trusted reference material and consistency across systems. What's your thoughts on that and oversharing? This whole idea that I can just ask the DMS anything and I'll just get an answer back.
I think it's definitely an area of concern when it comes to AI, particularly when you're working with multiple different AI tools, because your documents in the DMS, don't sit in neutral folders. They live within these governed systems with, matter permissions, ethical walls, client-specific restrictions. And so when you introduce AI into that environment, you need to think about, what are these tools doing with your documents, and are they keeping those permissions secure? I don't want to get too technical, but I think there's kind of 2 different ways that third-party AI can interact with your DMS. And the first is what we call the sync model. So the tool essentially creates a copy of your document and stores it outside your DMS in its own system, and then it syncs periodically. But the problem with that is that if a permission changes in your DMS, then it has to eventually make its way to the external copy. And there could be a lag depending on how often the sync runs. So that creates what we call governance drift. So, the quiet accumulation of ungoverned documents across a variety of different AI tools used by different users. And then there's another model retrieval-based integrations where the documents don't ever leave your DMS. AI comes to the documents and it queries the content, the governance in real time at the point of entry, and it never creates a copy. So this is a much more secure-based system, and this is the model that NetDocuments uses. So I think the question that firms really need to be asking when they adopt an AI tool is, how does it work? What does it do with your documents? Does it check these permissions against the live system? Because you can't just govern what AI generates. You also have to look at what it does to your documents as well, because that's a very important governance piece.
It's really interesting because I would imagine people don't think about that too much, because it's like, I've got a problem here, I'm looking for a solution. And we've all seen these sort of circumstances where a precedent is set and it's there, and then somebody downloads it. Actually, it's easier to have it on my own share, and then I just use it, and then it gets out of date, because it's not stored centrally, it's not kept up to date with the knowledge teams or your professional support lawyers and stuff like that, and before you know it, you've got that governance drift. It's a real challenge, isn't it? So in terms of lots of this stuff, have we got some practical things that we can give colleagues out there? And if there's anybody who wants to ask any specific questions, please stick it in the chat. We're open to questions. But is there any practical things that, possibly you, Nigel, that you've seen that make a difference in, governing and controlling some of this stuff, and what can sometimes feel like a little bit of a Wild West when it comes to working practices?
Yeah, gosh, it's an expansive question, really, that, Tony. A lot of it depends on where you are on that pilot to production kind of piece. One of the practical things is really just do an information architecture audit. Where does your information exist? So, and the type of information and what restrictions you need around it. So back to the oversharing problem, it's going to be a real issue if you start oversharing HR payroll data without kind of putting the barriers around it. So doing an information architecture audit just to understand the types of data, where it is, what restrictions, those kind of things as a foundation is the first level of governance. It's the first level of understanding. You can practically go out and do that. It's not pleasant. It's hard work. It requires a lot of thought process around doing it. But, there are lots of tools in way to create that kind of architecture registry where things exist. So that would be one thing I would do. Perhaps think also from a people perspective. You may want to consider stewardship. And what do I mean by that is disseminating the ownership for data and being crystal clear around who owns it, who updates it, when it's updated, what the quality is around that. So you start to embed more discipline around data. So back to Colleen's example, DMS. Who's the data stewards for the DMS, for example? If you probably go and ask that question, you will probably get that. Everybody would say, I think it's X instead of Y. Have a simple kind of develop some working groups around data stewardship, start to socialize why this is important, get people on board, start to link it to your information audit, that certain areas here lend themselves well to certain types of data steward. Let's use another example. If you are using CRM data, within the context of the CRM data, who are the data stewards that ensure that those records are clean? How do you make sure that they are right? So it's all foundational, and it kind of seems obvious, but my observation is not a lot of people put the time and consideration into doing that. So just a few thoughts there, Tony, around some of the more practical things you can do around getting the foundation moving in the right direction.
And it's great to hear from somebody in your role those sort of core principles around, those practical core principles around doing the data architecture assessment, looking at how things are set up. I think one of the things that we should really consider is, as the business leaders, there's nobody else to ask in your room. You're the person. It's getting behind your knowledge workers and your KM people who have been talking about this sort of stuff. And come back to Colleen's, it is just a digital library, you know, so why doesn't it have the same disciplines as a physical library? And I'm sure librarians who have now kind of moved into this kind of innovation space and AI space are really pushing and saying, look, we've been talking about this for years, you know, getting our data in a kind of structure and an order. And it's quite interesting how that's a really accepted norm, that actually you go into a library, you need to find where it is, so it's all laid out in a specific way so that you don't wander around looking at every single book before you get the thing you want, you know, fact, fiction, you know, whatever. Whereas we don't really draw those disciplines into the digital world, and it's, you know, sometimes it's the complacency of, we can just store it and we can find it. So Colleen, having a think about the kind of getting, you know, moving those pilots into, you know, everyday working, and thinking about the people and the process, just not actually the technology. Have you got any insights? I know you're really early into your career at NetDocs, but obviously within your career as a lawyer, are there any insights that you can give us around how can we make sure that there's, you know, we're producing the best readiness, or, you know, the tools and things that we need to provide to lawyers to make sure that they can make that challenging behavioural and process change that we know that's coming?
I think there's two things in particular that I would highlight. The first is a very visible AI policy. I think lawyers are very professionally cautious, and they need to be told what tools they can and can't use, and specifically what the tools they can use for what, because not all AI tools are the same. Not all AI tools can handle client data. And also that will then address shadow AI, because you will have lawyers at your firm that will be using AI tools, even if there's not a specific policy for it, and that creates liability for the firm. So the AI policy helps address that as well. And then I think the second, perhaps the most important one, is training. And I think that comes in a couple different forms. I think a general firm-wide training about, you know, the policy, you know, how it's governed is important. But I also think you need to get more specific. And this is how it was rolled out at Freshfields, which I think worked really well. There was I think it was like 7 or 8 sessions firm-wide, and then we had sessions for each practice group, and how specifically how these AI tools can apply to your use case for this specific practice group. And that made a massive impact, because having that sort of peer review, you know, that acceptance, other people showing you how and what worked, really helped drive adoption and show how creative you can be with these tools, because there really is an element of creativity in how lawyers use them as well. And so I think all of these things together really help drive adoption and kind of foster the trust in the product.
That whole adoption thing, you know, it's been hanging around, you know, for many a year, and particularly in the legal space. You know, it's not something I experienced in the engineering world. Adoption was, you know, it's a PLC. You just do what you're told and you just crack on with it, you know. Whereas because of the creativity and in the legal space and the lawyers themselves, there's that challenge around, you actually, you know, this is how I've always done it, or this is the way that my practice area does it. You know, so it's really interesting to hear, you know, that we need to educate people on how to use these technologies and how to use them in specifics related to their practice area or their task in a day-to-day thing. What about and Nigel, throw this back at you, what about the sort of undocumented workarounds and you know, the ways that people just sort of, you've heard that a million times probably, you know, this is a really great tool. I love the idea of it, but it's not really going to work in my practice, but it'll work in someone else's practice. You know, anything that we can support colleagues with around that sort of space.
Yeah, it's a great question. You know, it's the NIMBYism. You know, it's great, but not in my backyard. Thank you very much. It's you know, we hear that, you know, not just in law firms, but everywhere. I think some of the ways that people can think about this is, and this is a question we ponder quite regularly. What is the return on investment for the piece of AI I'm using, or this piece of work I'm doing? And you know, lots of people, you know, are, you know, rushing to test AI out, do things with it, but I don't see a huge amount of real ROI constructs around measuring the value of what you're doing. And if the way I think one option you may have for, introducing, or improving adoption is proving there's a real value to use the tool. There's a real value for me. What's in it for me kind of construct. And it kind of threads and ties what we've been talking about together. Because if you can observe that the tool is working as expected, if you can observe that the tool is hitting the right data in the right way and it's providing that insight, and you can measure that against where you are today without doing it and where you want to be tomorrow by setting some metrics, you can't, it's really hard to argue with data, facts and measurement, So just practical ways of doing that is setting that out, working with the people that might want to adopt. How do you think that this, and not just thinking about time saving, because everybody rushes to the time saving element. AI is going to take, is going to create more time. Well, that we've heard that way before AI. Robotic process automation, automation in general is going to save time. I don't think any of us have ever seen time being saved. Other ways you might want to think about it: does it create more capacity in the organization rather than time? So if these tools and the data connected together create a place where I'm generating more capacity to be more creative, to have more client relationships, to do the kind of things that make a difference to me, that's a way that you can increase adoption. If you can prove that it's going to give you that more space to generate more business, to be more cared and considered with your client, not that they're not, but it gives you that extra space. Those are some of the things that you can work with people around adopting, because you're kind of proving, the proof is in the pudding, the old saying. So those would be some of the things I would think about for the audience. Is how are you going to observe it? How are you going to prove it's got the value? Is it really hitting, the expectation of how this tool and the data may work?
It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because adoption is often talked about, and or lack of adoption is often talked about. And I over the years I've sort of become slightly older, slightly more determined in my view around actually adoption is really part of our accountability. It's not something that we can just hand to the legal teams and say, you need to get your lawyers to adopt this. We really need to take accountability for the adoption of some of this stuff. And I like your way of looking at it, instead of this idea of we're going to save you 10 minutes, 20 minutes, and how do you convert that? Because that rubs up against this whole idea of the billable hour and stuff like that. But really, value minutes and value creation. So here's some value minutes, and how you choose to use those value minutes is really down to the firm around it, how it's it's productivity, how you're measured, etc. And those things tend to be slight, they're in our influence. They're certainly not in our control as the parts of the business that we are accountable for. But certainly, as business executive in these sort of businesses, we really do need to demonstrate that actually these value minutes need to be measured and then utilised. Because there is no there's no return on that investment if it's just time that you use to go to water cooler, or time that you use to go home, unless you're already working 150%, and then you can actually say, right, I can still do the same volume, but I can do it quicker and better, and therefore I don't need to be here for 11, 12, 13 hours a day. And that's when you can push an open door with those value minutes. Those undocumented workarounds and stuff, it's really hard to get a good understanding without sitting inside the legal space. And one of the things I've seen a lot, and Colleen's a great example of, our legal business partners, our service providers coming into drawing lawyers into the community to help build products that are easier to adopt. Colleen, if you get any sort of hints and tips or things that you might want to help the audience with, or around how you would get adoption done in your if you are sort of still sitting back in Freshfields in front of your laptop, doing the day-to-day job?
I think one of the most important ones, which I touched on a little bit earlier, is just having internal champions. And I don't mean like, just an email from the managing partner saying that it's a priority, but I think trusted peers on each team. So one thing that I did as a senior associate was we set up just a 2-minute slot at the end of weekly team meetings for associates to kind of talk about what they were using AI to do in the past week. And that was very specific to our individual practice. And that showed how people were using it. And it was really interesting to see how creative people were with it and how helpful it could be in our practice. And so I think that sort of thing, it sounds quite small, but it has a really large impact, because then people are confronted directly with how much time saving they can get from it, and that's very impactful.
It often is the small things that make the biggest difference, So if you're doing those small things in your practice area, but you multiply how many practice areas you have and how many firms we have, and if everybody's doing the same sort of thing, we're all pushing it in the same direction, and those behavioural changes are much better driven from peer to peer rather than we've got an IT education team or a people and culture education team coming in and saying, "Oh, this is how you need to use this technology," or this is the process change you need to make," and identifying those champions and bringing them into the inner circle and allowing them to support the direction of travel that the overall firm's going on. Has always been something that I've been really keen on to try and find those naturally curious people that sit inside your organisation that are looking to not drive efficiencies to make me more productive, but actually just I'm interested in moving things along. How did we get from the cave days to we've got a Tesco in every corner, sort of thing. And it has to be naturally curious, inquisitive people that drive that forward, doesn't it? The evolution that we've seen over the last however long. So we've got a fantastic question, and I've no idea how to ask the question, so I'll just ask the question as it's been written. We've got a question in the chat, and I'm going to ask you, Nigel, right? Because maybe unfair to ask Colleen, but I'm sure Colleen will have a view on it. Rather than will we be addressing, let's see if we can address the impact of quantum computing on law firm data and how to protect against that risk. Is a question that we've had from Larry.
Gosh, where do I start with this question then?
Great question.
Yeah. Well, first of all, let's see the first product of quantum computing that can interact with law firm data before we try to answer the question. I'm not deflecting the question, but studies that I've seen, and I'm not an expert in quantum computing, I've got a general interest in it, but I'm not an expert, is a lot of the use cases are more aligned to solving more mathematical type of issues, cryptography, those kind of things. I haven't seen, and I could be wrong, there may be people out there that are doing this right now, using what we would see as general kind of data we'd see in a law firm. So that may happen, it may not. I think where concern for me would be more real right now is not the quantum computing, but things around the hype, if you believe, mythos that we saw from Anthropic, that seems to have the ability to break quite a lot of cryptography and the security we would wrap around data. I think if that is to be believed, that it actually can do what is the hype says it could do, those kind of actors and those kind of threats to law firm data are the ones I'd be more concerned about right now. AI-driven tooling that has the ability to at scale, at speed, undermine security and data structures rather than quantum computing. And that's where I think the next battleground is in terms of some of the sophisticated technologies. So Larry, apologies if I didn't really get into the mechanics of quantum computing and qubits and things like that. But it's hopefully that kind of steers you in terms of how I'd be thinking about it. I can see you put another question in the thing, and I don't take it as being contentious at all. That's absolutely fine. And I know bad actors are already harvesting now and decrypting now. I think there is. Is there a danger in waiting for commercial availability? Yes. Do we work with our strategic security partners around these threats? Yes. And we take a guidance and advice from those individuals that will keep us kind of on the front piece. I think where law firms can invest, and a suggestion would be, is really to keep, if you haven't got an information security team that's part of the organization, that's on the front foot with this, then, partner up with someone that is increasingly looking at these threat actors and the ability to move at scale and speed and harvest. That's where the investment needs to be. It's, we're all thinking about AI, but again, Larry, it's a great question, because this is a fundamental piece of our infrastructure and how firms operate, is keeping our data safe. And therefore, the investment needs to be pushed into that as much as it is into AI.
And it's quite interesting to use those types of, sort of marketing hype to your benefit as you stand up in front of the rest of your colleagues, at whatever level you are in the organisation, around taking accountability for what your day-to-day tasks are, and saying, look, we need to be aware of these things. Yes, quantum computing is something that's been talked about a lot, and like everything, and it's coming down the pipe possibly. And if you believe some of the stuff that you hear, wherever you get your information these days about, involved, the number of coders that are being hired by the big tech companies is going down because they're coding with AI 25%, 30%, 50%, and it was inevitable that you would get this idea where AI would start to look for vulnerabilities, because that's, if you're doing the day-to-day work, then you quite easily flip to see where the challenges and opportunities to exploit are. I think we've got another question, which I'm going to flick to you, Colleen, because I'm not going to ask you about quantum computing. My answer to the question to Larry would have been no. We're not going to address the impact of quantum computing. But we have a question which talks about, which takes me on to measurement and value, a couple of areas that we haven't quite touched on yet, around how do you measure the success, the ROI? How do we go about auditing? What people are using some of this technology for. And I'll sort of shine a light on one of the big legal players put this really big thing out. It's 1 million prompts for £1 million bonus. And the question is what was the value in the million prompts? Were they just, prompts to get the number, or were they really driving value for our clients? So Colleen, measurement and sort of auditing around tools.
I think there's a couple different ways that you can measure the tools. And I mean, there's the adoption rate, which is often a common one. Are lawyers actually using the tools? How often? How are they using them? But I think perhaps a more important question is it actually improving the product? Is it making the legal work better, delivered faster, and ultimately giving a better service for the client? Because I think that's ultimately, for the law firm, what's most important. And that one is trickier to measure. How can you compare that? I think it's a difficult thing, but perhaps more important than actual measuring AI adoption. And I think when it comes down to the ROI, that's a very tricky discussion. We touched on it a little bit earlier, because then you start thinking about the billable hour model. So if you're using these tools to increase your efficiency, and these tools are not cheap, they can cost firms quite a lot. And then in the end, it reduces the time spent on a task, which means they bill less. Then, how does that equation work out? So it's a tricky discussion, and I think one that the legal industry hasn't quite grappled with yet. But it'll be very interesting to see in the next couple of years kind of how the economics of a law firm adapts to this.
It's quite an interesting, for me, I was doing something for our chief exec recently because we were talking about, is this the death of the industry? Because all of the hype that comes out, and really, if you he kind of challenged me to be able to articulate to him that this was not an overnight sensation. This is not overnight we're going to lose all lawyers. And what I was going back to the early the noughties, the late 90s when we started to put PCs in people's desks and we started to introduce email and then we start, you think of the evolution of what we've done in a document over the last 20 years, and Nigel, you talked about automation, general automation and RPA, robotic process automation and stuff like that. But we have brought sort of basic things in like virtual files, which are efficiency tools. The virtual file is there to allow knowledge to be shared across the group. So that's an efficiency tool. We weren't really worried about the virtual file. We weren't thinking, well, the virtual file is here now, so what does that do to my billable hour? Email, and actually products that then allows you to do your due diligence much quicker, by pouring a whole load of data into a tool and then setting some parameters and then being able to analyze that data much quicker. And so I think it's an evolution rather than, these things just being, it's just going to eat your lunch. I think we can't be complacent, absolutely, because the reasoning aspect of generative AI and the potential that has for people or non-lawyers having a kind of legal view on some content. But yeah, in my business, we're looking at adoption and how we then take that adoption into how that drives better value for the client. And it's really for us, something I've said quite a lot lately is when you very few industries do you break down the task or break down the way that the person performs the task and then apply that to your logic around how much it should cost. Yeah. You tend to just buy the thing based on, value to you, so if you want to buy, if you take your car to the garage and get it repaired, you don't ask the garage mechanic how he goes about or how she goes about their task. You just say, well, it's cost me £500 to get a service, and it's not going to go down because they now use a computer as opposed to 20 years of experience and about with a hammer and a torch. So often I feel we challenge ourselves more on these things, and I think getting to that point where we can be more clear around value pricing, because it's outcomes that our clients are focused on, and that's where AI will start to drive. So really focusing on how firms measure the value outcome, I think is where you were sort of going with as well, Colleen. And then how does that, then build the ROI into that, because at the end of the day, if you're using a piece of technology to support you in delivering a better outcome for a client, then working at how you price for that, that's a challenge, but it's not unsurmountable. Our accountancy colleagues do it. Others do it all the time and is normal part of their business model. I think sometimes we spend a little bit too much time focused on it. Yeah. Anything from you, Nigel, on ROI and monitoring? Anything that you want to say? Is there anything that you've seen that's really adding some significant value?
Just a few thoughts and the follow-up to the question that was in the chat, and more importantly, against AI governance policy. It goes without saying that this is just another area that demands and needs good, strong governance in the way you're using it, how it's applied, the risk understanding around it, and perhaps even more so because some of the other tools where you have information security or user acceptance policies, it's kind of a defined thing, what it is, whereas AI is an area that is still evolving. We're still learning how we are going to thread this in. And I think good governance across that is essential. Now, that presents its own challenges, like any governance approach. How do you apply governance? How do you measure against that it's been applied right? How do you know that people are adhering to that governance policy? I mean, I'm sure we all know stories of people using public-facing ChatGPT to put documents into, so how do you block that, or do you create a capability within the organization that encourages, because it's robust and it's extensible, people not to go to ChatGPT and use it securely? So there's lots within that governance. The question is, also, how do you measure that then? And a lot of the time right now, AI in some ways is a black box, particularly if you start to see some of the capabilities and vendors that you've already got in there introduce a piece of AI capability just as part of your contract, say a SaaS service. All of a sudden, you've got AI capability within that. How are you measuring that? How are you governing against that? What is starting to emerge, and what we are seeing now, are people trying to answer this question by bringing in observability platforms that operate very similar to kind of security platforms. And what you're doing is you're aligning your governance policies against that platform. So then it's got a way of detecting and measuring whether the policy has been breached or not, and those kind of things. Also connecting, services to your information barriers authoritative list. What can you use? What can't you use? So it's a big topic, AI governance, and it needs some good thought around it. But people are starting to get their arms around this. They are starting to grapple with it, and realizing there isn't one single answer to this. It's a multidisciplinary answer.
Notwithstanding what I said earlier about evolution rather than this being a complete transformation, is this really the inflection point? Is this really the point at which the legal industry really sort of embraces what other industries have embraced over the last 20, 30, 40 years around the value pricing, how we value our service versus the outcome rather than how many minutes it takes us? And I'll start with you, Colleen, on that one, because you're closer to it than I, Jonah.
I think we're not going to see the end of the billable hour, but I think its dominance will definitely lessen. Because I think, as we were talking earlier, the billable hour has always been used as a proxy for the value of the service provided. If an associate takes 6 hours to draft a memo, then you bill 6 hours. Yeah. But if AI can produce a comparable draft in about 20 minutes, then that equation starts to break down. And that's not because the value of the end product has lessened, but because the time it takes is no longer a proxy for value. And what law firms how they respond to that, I think will depend, because law firms, they're not monolithic. There's many different practice areas. Each practice area does different work. They have different client relationships, and most importantly, different risk profiles. So a lot of the work law firms produces creates liability for the firms. So I was a capital markets associate, and one big thing that we did was issue a 10b5 letter. And that creates quite a lot of work in terms of due diligence, which could potentially be very simplified with AI. But then, the risk the firm takes on and giving that to the client is still there. So I think you're going to see a bit of a mixed model where there's going to be, billable hour pricing where it's reasonable and where it makes sense. Fixed fees and value-based pricing will become a bit more common, but it's going to be very much a hybrid approach.
I think one of the things, and Nigel, so we're getting to the bottom of the hour here, so we better make sure that we wrap up. One of the things I query is, do we get to the point where change control is added into the price that you give to the client? So here's the price that we're estimating, but we're going to introduce change control, and therefore, as we go through that and as we go through the process of delivering the outcome, when things that we haven't thought about arise, then actually having those dialogues and conversation and change control is a good thing. Something that we are very used to in the technology industry as we buy services from our providers. But guys, thank you very much. We're at the bottom of the hour, and I'm going to wrap it up here and just say thank you to everybody for joining this session with the Global Tech Talks. I hope you really found it enjoyable. These are produced by NetLaw Media, and it's been an interesting discussion, and it's been my pleasure to host, which I think was a kind of thought-provoking panel. I think it's a real challenge to have these conversations when it's focused on governance and things like that. But I really do thank both panelists, and obviously thank NetDocs for NetDocuments for putting this on. And again, just leaves me to say thank you for joining us, and don't forget to like and subscribe today, as it were, so to speak, and join our future discussions. Thank you very much, everybody.